Welcome to today's episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we're diving into one of the most foundational elements of personal and professional growth, core values. Our guest today is Robert Glazer, a New York Times bestselling author and one of today's most respected voices in leadership. His brand new book, A Compass Within, explores how aligning your core values can transform the way you lead, work, and live. Because core values aren't just motivational posters or nice to haves. They shape our decisions, our relationships, and our sense of purpose. In this conversation, Robert shares how discovering and living by your values can unlock greater clarity, resilience, and fulfillment. So if you've been feeling stuck, scattered, or just searching for direction, this episode might be exactly what you need. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Let's start with that big picture concept, core values. You've made the case that core values really are more than just aspirational traits. They're deeply embedded in who we are. So help us understand how core values can actually shape the decisions we make in both our lives personally and professionally.
As I kind of said, and I tried to describe in the book, I think a lot of people think of their core values. They try to pick things that they want to be. When you figure these things out or you discover them, you should have a lot of epiphanies because it should almost be like a stencil that if you look back on everything, you're like, oh, well, that makes total sense. So it's a little bit like the instruction manual that no one ever gave you to yourself. I think for a lot of people, it's not that they don't have them and they probably feel them. They probably know when they're doing things that are feel really good and when they're not. It's just not the ability not to be able to label them and know kind of consciously what they are makes them then not able to use it a decision making rubric, and that really is the most important thing that you can do with values. So I talk about the big three in the compass within, but we can dive into particularly I think these are more embedded in people's leadership styles than they realize, but sort of your vocation and how you choose to lead and the work that you're in, your sort of partner and your community. And without core values alignment, I think it's hard to make those things work.
Oh, and you're right. Those core values, they are your internal compass that drives every decision you make. What prompted you to embark on this journey and really how did it affect both your leadership and your personal life?
Yeah, so the epiphany for me was like 3 or 4 years ago when someone was reading my bio at a conference, and I realized that, like, everything that was listed on there was sort of in this after core values period. So I had been invited in 2013 to attend a pretty exclusive global leadership program with the Entrepreneurs Organization. There was about 25 people in that, and I really thought we were going to like learn how to lead other people and all these tactics and communication, which we did. But the first 2 days was kind of a deep breakdown, and I would say it was like a mirror, and it was like, who are you and what do you value? And it actually asked kind of like Simon Sinek's book, his first book around Start With Why. It kind of asked the important questions. It just didn't give us the answers and tell us how to do it. So I left that being like, wow, I think I really like that. My values are really important to me. Like, I know I'm a values driven leader. I just don't know what they are. I can't articulate them. And I sort of spent a 6 to 9 month period figuring that out for myself and didn't like any of the stuff that was out there. And then over the years, we started teaching this to our leadership classes at Acceleration Partners. And I built sort of a process that was really scalable and it worked to help people extract their core values. And I saw the impact it had. So then I turned it into a course. And so that was, and then eventually into a book. But that's sort of, it all started with kind of me trying to figure out myself. And as you get into the depth of what makes kind of a good core value, like these lists that you see everywhere, these kind of one word lists, they don't really, that it doesn't do it and it doesn't help you. But that's sort of, if you go looking online, that's what you'll find.
It is. And you mentioned that the majority of your success really came after your core values were discovered. So your ACVD. And prior to that, you had kind of this patchwork quilt approach, right? That you described earlier by just emulating the best leadership qualities you've seen and avoiding the worst. But in the end, that's not going to be enough to enable an individual to fulfill their true potential in life or as a leader.
Yeah, look, I think that's a very logical thing to do, right? And what most of us do, is that we take, and this is where a lot of our core values come from, even we're running away from things or trying to run towards it, but we take like these best and worst practices from other leaders that we've had and we apply them. And I sort of had this moment in my career where I did that and it just didn't feel right. It felt like sort of this Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And I think I've spoken at companies, they've given me their leadership standards, and they give me this whole thing. This is how we want people to lead and show up and all this stuff. And I'll say, take this as a given, but you're not telling people how they should lead and what kind of leader they should be, right? And they're like, no, no, no. So there's this standard of how leader shows up in that company. But if you take Jim Collins' kind of level 5, that sort of definition of sort of transcendent leadership, I think these are the people with deep self-awareness, and they're leading very differently from somewhere else. And they understand their values. Look, your values can be really helpful if you're aware of them, but they also can be massive Achilles heel. I know a lot of people who have been leading very poorly because of their one or more of their values, because they couldn't articulate it to them. They were making decisions based on it, and there are a few that I've seen are pretty problematic, but they weren't actually telling anyone and they weren't actually aware of it. And so that's kind of destructive. Part of this process with leadership, when you figure it out, is to go have an honest discussion with your team and your peers and like, look, this is what's really important to me. Here are my red lines. I kind of need to know if they're crossed, and here's what happens if you cross them.
Well, and you're right. I mean, for great leaders, it's really that they have a solid foundation built on authenticity and self-awareness. And that foundation only comes through an understanding of their core values. And like you said, with Jim Collins' book, Level 5 leaders can articulate what's important to them and use that clarity to motivate and inspire others. And it sounds like, though, this journey of discovery for you was a very personal one and also a professional one. And in the book, you use a parable to illustrate the process of discovering core values. Why did you choose this format, and how does this storytelling framework really make this journey of self-discovery more effective?
I figured this out for myself. I talked a lot about core values and Elevate. People would sort of ask me about them, and I'd point them to a bunch of resources about, look, this is a lot of work. There's no easy answer. I started working on that process and that system, worked on the course. I was like, this really works. The people that we've done this with have seen, I'm just watching them change as leaders, and it's awesome. Like, how do I get this message to more people? I was like, so I should write a book about this. But I actually thought a book on core values would just not be interesting to read, or it just wouldn't, someone would want to pull it off the shelf because they're like you need to know the problem a little bit to want to do it. So some of my favorite books I've read, Pat Lencioni's books, The Goal, Bob Berg's The Goal Giver, a lot parable. I really loved that format. I love the storytelling. I usually read them in the day. And although I had no idea how to do it, it's really like fiction. It's like, maybe I'll try this. So, I spent a couple years on the book, and I had to learn character development and remember things about characters, and my time sequences were off. But I liked particularly Lencioni's style of, let me show you what I'm trying to teach you, and then I'll tell you explicitly what you saw at the end. And I felt like that worked really well. I had someone in a group a few weeks ago was describing sort of a problem and a struggle they were dealing with. And I had actually sent them the book to get their feedback on it. I was like, look, I don't want to be like this guy, but like someone else had read it too in the group. I was like, I actually think like the book is exactly this sort of situation. So they went home and read it that night and wrote me a note, and they're like, wow, that was like, it was like, so the character, Jamie, whether you resonate with him or his situation or his values, it just is kind of a mirror for you to think about these situations in yourself and the ones you've had or you're likely to have. And I think it worked really well as sort of an introspective way of looking at it.
You're right. And I found that same thing from reading the book is by following Jamie's journey, readers can relate to the struggles of discovering core values in a way that feels more real and applicable in their own lives. It's one thing, right, to read about a theory about core values. It's a whole other thing to see a character go through the process, face challenges, and emerge with clarity. It just, for me, it makes the journey feel more accessible and relatable by choosing that format.
Yeah, I've had a bunch of people who've read it to all send me their like real stories. They're like, this relationship, this work break, like these were all my moments, and so it's fun. I actually should collect those and try to do something with them. I'm gonna make a note on that right now so I don't forget.
Well, leaders who are clear on their core values can lead from a place of authenticity, which builds trust and credibility with their teams. And especially in challenging times, it's important for leaders to show up as themselves and make decisions that are grounded in their core values, helping their teams, right, become more secure and inspired, that are core to who they are, get promoted and shown in the workplace.
This is tricky, and this is where people get a little bit confused because there's company core values, right? And in fact, when we would go to take our leaders off site and do this personal core value work, they're like, "Wait a sec, like we're not doing the company's values," and we're like, "No, no, you know the company's values. Yours should align to them, right?" So there's the company's values, but then this is yourself, right? And how you kind of show up as a leader. And I probably can again share this best with an example. So I have a couple people we've done this work with, and it's very clear that they have a core value of trust. And this, like the book, the story will let me give you a few real examples. So, and a lot of core values I have found they come from deep foundational experiences in your life, often childhood. I say there are a lot of leaders. I have seen two people arguing about a budget, and I know a lot about them. And I know that this person grew up with not enough money, and this person grew up like not feeling heard. And that's actually what's like going on in this argument. Like this person wants to spend too much, and this person isn't listening to this person. So we carry around a lot of this stuff with us. So I have a couple leaders who have shown a real like trust is relationships built on trust is a core part of their values. And this overlaps a little bit with the why stuff that Gary Sanchez has done. And so I know the questions to ask. And one of the questions when someone has a trust is, let me ask you, I don't want to know the story, but did you have a violation of trust early in your childhood or early in your life that was formative? And usually if I ask that question, their eyes well up and they get kind of emotional. I'm like, look, don't want to know what it is, but that's a pretty good test that this is a value for you. So this sort of leader shows up in the workplace and they sort people into people that they can trust or not trust. Right. And when you show up 5 minutes late for a meeting, when you miss a deadline, when you can't be found at 4 in the afternoon and you forgot to tell them you were taking the day off, like this strikes kind of like deep things that this person can't be trusted. And like this is a real operating system problem for that person. And so what you find is that a lot of their team is in jail with the key thrown out and don't know it, and they're operating that way. And I once had an HR person tell me who was working with one of these people, like, yeah, I couldn't quite figure out why people on their team were always like on a performance review or getting a rate. Like it just didn't make sense to me. Now, this is a potentially very problematic thing for a leader to have. But if they realize it, they own it, they articulate it, and they went back to what someone has come back to their team and said, "You're on my team." Like, Charles, just so you know, trust is really important to me as a leader, and you have it until it's gone from me. And here are the types of things that lose it. And if you ever feel distance, it's probably because trust is gone, and you should come to me and we should have a conversation. And then I might go to my boss and say, "Hey, Sarah, just so you know, trust is really important to me. And sometimes I'll overwork to earn it. And I just need to, if you ever don't trust me, like I need to know it." Right. This is the sort of a joke. Like sometimes people say, "Isn't this feels like therapy?" So I was like, look, the difference between some of this, and I am not looking to blame anything. Like we're not going back and looking back to blame, but we're saying this is how you show up as a human in the workplace today. And you either are aware of this or not aware of it. And there's 100 other examples of people who, but what we usually do with leaders is once they have this and they really figure it out, they're kind of go share it with their team and they're excited to. Like, here's my playbook as a leader, and here's what I need you to do, and here are my red lines. And that makes it pretty authentic for them.
Well, and it makes perfect sense, right? You want to be transparent. Once you're aware of those, why not share with others so you know how you show up and what's important to you? That's going to help the people you lead and the people that are above you as well to react more effectively. And let's get back to the organization piece, because you made an important statement that many organizations claim to have strong values, yet there's often that disconnect between what they espouse and how employees actually behave. And you give a great example in the book between Enron and Netflix. Perhaps unpack that to say, here's who did it wrong, and here's a company that really did it right.
Yeah, so Enron during their height of their maybe malfeasance, I guess, they had core values like integrity, respect, and That's just not how you got promoted at Enron. You got promoted at Enron for taking ridiculous risks, probably stabbing other people in the back and other things. So the culture was very different from what was on the wall. Like that was trying, they were sort of just generic slogans that were trying to appeal to everyone. I think a great culture does not try to appeal to everyone. So Netflix in their core value deck had things like average outcome with hard work equals severance, and little work and great outcome equals promotion. And we don't, they just had a bunch of things that would offend some people, almost frankly, and attract them. It was very clear they weren't platitudes. They weren't trying to be everything to everyone. And that's how you know sort of a real culture. And ideally, you would, if you had a sense of your own values and an idea of the cultural values, then you'd be like, this is a great fit for me, or I'm a great fit for my boss, or I'm not a great fit for my boss. But I've had a lot of people say, well, what if someone does this work in my company and they realize they're not a fit for the company, right? I'm like, great. Like they're going to leave at some point. Like maybe you help them figure this out early. And we did this years ago. I helped someone figure this out, and they actually had it coming off a kind of health scare. And they just realized that, like, why I don't want to be doing this, right now, that my health, and this is a priority in my life. And they went and took some time off. And I think that's a good outcome, not a bad outcome.
Well, and these statements, I love, just to reiterate that these statements that Netflix made are likely to turn many people off. And that's exactly the point. They repelled people who wouldn't fit into that culture, and they attracted the people they needed to build a successful company with that authentic culture that they already identified the values for.
Yeah, and look, you're not, I always say universities are a good example, right? Think of, and you think of a company culture. A university like Michigan, a large city campus school, right, has a fundamentally different value proposition than a school like Bates, a small New England rural school. They're not trying to, the only difference between them and companies is they're not trying to, Bates isn't trying to pretend they're Michigan, and Michigan isn't, they're saying, look, this is why you would come here, and this is our value proposition, and we're consistent with it. So I think if we, there's a whole separate track or book that could be written about company values, but if a company is just honest about what it values, and then it helps employees figure out what they value, it's going to make the right connections. And again, the people who aren't the right people will realize that and probably self-select out. Our company has an excel and improve value. And as I've done the work with a lot of our leaders over the years, they inherently have one of these values that's about always getting better and improve. And like, yeah, this is why we found you. And this is why you like it here, because of this thing. But I've always said our company was for, I mean, we won 30 best places to work awards, but we were for like 2% of the people. Like how we worked and the type of work we like, we're not a consensus organization. Like we're a digital marketing firm. We had a core value of own it, right? If you're someone who wanted to get everyone's perspective on something before making a decision, like that's great for like a nuclear power plant, but that doesn't work for digital marketing. Like you need to like make a decision and act, and that's what the clients want. And so there's certain qualities that would be really, there's certain values that someone had that would be really like include all perspectives. That's a core value someone had. That works in certain environments, and you should seek environments where that is the orientation most of the time. And then there's some jobs and careers and markets where that's a really horrible match.
And I found it's also important to reward and recognize behaviors that align with those values and hold people accountable when they don't, because alignment is not automatic and it requires consistent effort from leadership to really reinforce those behaviors within the organization.
Yeah, yellow flags. You're showing people where the end zone is, and then you need people throwing yellow flags when people go offsides or out of bounds.
Let's get back to what you said earlier. And really, I wanted to kind of unpack this more is how can understanding the connection between your past experiences and current values help you navigate your relationships and careers? Because what you say is talking about core values, they often have roots in our formative years.
The point here is to go back, understand it, understand that this fully formed 30 or 40 or 50-year-old, maybe if they're a 20-year-old, they could really change some of the stuff if they wanted to, but this is their operating system now, and this is how they show up. And there's advantages and disadvantages. So one of my dominant core values is find a better way and share it. That's why I wrote this book. That's why I'm on this podcast. That's why I do a lot of this stuff. When I'm leading, I'm really clear to people on my team or hiring them. Look, I'm about find a better way and improvement. Like again, if you're a sort of like I like steady and repeatability, you will not like teams that I'm in and organization. Like I like to rip it up. And I hired someone years ago who was bored, and I was like, "You'll never be bored." And 5 years later, I was like, "Are you bored?" He's like, "Nope, not bored." I was like, "He's like other problems, but not bored." So again, I can be really honest about that, and I can also be honest about where that came from, and making sure that I also have to understand that it can be a weakness, right? And then in trying to prove, I tend to exhaust people, right? I exhaust my family or my wife or otherwise constantly, and she'll use verbiage like, "Hey, let's not make this better. Like, I've got reservations for tonight, and like, let's leave it alone. And we're going on this trip." Like, because we talked about this. She knows this. And in the organization, I have to realize if I try to make everything better, I'll just frustrate people to the point where nothing's better.
From your experience, adults are not very likely to change who they are at their core unless there's a major transformation they want to enact in their lives. So we really need to find people that are already aligned with our core values by asking them behavior-based questions for each one of these values as we're trying to interview them for company or to even make major life decisions, correct?
Again, let me split these into two different buckets because it gets messy. So yeah, on the company side, we do some work that I don't really publicize on helping companies kind of clean up and augment their core values. Again, it needs to be done by someone who really is in a position to and wants to change the organization, because sometimes the people who created the problem don't want to touch it. But there could be a couple acquisitions or a new leader, or someone's like, "I really want to fix this." And one of the things we do is like, look, at our company, half the questions were values oriented and half were aptitude oriented. And we just showed them really, they're like, "How do I do that?" Well, behavioral based questions around core values. And we'll list a bunch as an example. I'm actually giving one of these workshops tomorrow, and we came up with a bunch of questions around their new core values. So one of those values was own it. And one of the questions might be, tell me a time when you were given kind of like not great instruction and total responsibility for something and what happened with it. Jeff Smart, I've had on the podcast, one of the best interviewers in the world, GH Smart. Jeff always says, ask hypothetical questions and get hypothetical answers. So you should ask about real circumstances. So we tend to ask a positive and a negative. Or when was a time when you really didn't own it? What did that look like? So that's on the corporate side to make sure you're aligned. On the personal side, let's talk about like relationships. I think people confuse some values oriented things, which are like the big things, like you and your partner around your kids and choices and what do we want to do, like versus you like tennis and I like golf and things that are more sort of hobbies. I think you can have a lot of different hobbies and whatever, but you need to come together on the big things. Like in our family, we don't cheat and we tell the truth, and things that are fun, and we believe in health or things that are fundamentally important. Now, I guess in theory, while you're dating, you could ask behavioral based questions about these, but that might be a little bit awkward. I think there's even more the things you start to look for in a relationship and look early on. And these tend to come into play when people are stressed and they have to make these decisions, and you find out whether they're willing to throw out that principle or not. So I would encourage someone to have those moments. Look, when I was younger, I really think I conflated the two in terms of, again, activities and values. And I think you can think you have a lot of compatibility with your partner because you have a lot of the same activities. And then they have no problem with infidelity, right? And you hold that sacrosanct. Like that is probably a different sort of incompatibility.
Well, and when it comes to big life decisions, you highlight the big three: choosing a spouse, a career, and a community. And you say that your values don't need to be identical to the values of the people you work with, like what you were saying, your close friends, or even your partner. But even if they're not in total unison, it's crucial to be in harmony.
Yeah, they need to rhyme, and we got a little out of control with a lot of things, a couple years ago, things we could say and not say, and this notion of cultural fit started to get attacked, and I understand what people were saying, but I also really disagree with them. So, I think in an organization, any organization, you have to have some baseline things that you agree upon, and that to me is cultural fit, or people start saying it's cultural add, and I think they were playing with semantics. Cultural fit does not mean that everyone is a carbon copy, that they are the same gender, race, thought process, look alike, otherwise. But you have to have some common not bonds about why you're there and what you're doing. So one of the examples I gave in the book is like whatever religion, if you have a prayer group, on the weekends, you probably don't want a vocal atheist in that group, right? That group and that purpose is to discuss prayer and religion and otherwise. you could be friends with that atheist in a different concept. They live on your street, you want to go out to dinner with them, but like not in your prayer group, right? And so I think any organization has got to have some common this or any relationship kind of and why we're here. And interestingly, I think the community, particularly if you're picking it with your partner, I didn't talk about this in the book, but these probably go hand in hand, right? If your values aren't really aligned and clear, then picking a community that aligns with those values will be messy and you might want different communities.
When you're influenced by maybe the wrong communities or organizations, if you haven't identified what those core values are, you don't even know if you're in misalignment. But if you do identify what those are and you have it, then use those for these big decisions. I mean, it'll make for a more successful and happier life overall. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.